There's a very specific, cold-burning rage that ignites when you find a padlock on your own front door. Not a lock you put there, but a big, ugly, industrial-grade chunk of metal clamped through the handles of your French doors, accompanied by a bright orange sticker screaming violation, in a font usually reserved for biohazard warnings. I had been gone for 10 days, a much-needed architectural research trip to Spain, soaking in Gaudi's genius and blissfully ignoring the mundane world. I returned home, ready to collapse into my own bed, only to be met with this metallic insult. The violation, according to the sticker, was lawn maintenance failure. Exceeds 4-inch height limit. My grass was maybe 4.5 inches high. Apparently, in the People's Republic of Oakmont Estates, this was a crime punishable by illegal eviction. The notice was signed with an arrogant flourish by Karen Miller, HOA compliance officer. This wasn't my first run-in with Karen. She was a woman who wielded her clipboard like a scepter and interpreted the HOA covenants with the unbending zeal of a true believer. But this was a declaration of war. What Karen didn't know, however, as she sat in her beige sedan somewhere, feeling smug about enforcing order, was that she hadn't just padlocked the home of a tired architect. She had padlocked the home of a man whose entire career was built on understanding regulations, codes, and the precise, beautiful art of structural integrity, both in buildings and in legal arguments. And more importantly, she certainly didn't know that my cousin, Mark, wasn't just my favorite grilling companion, but was also the Honorable Judge Mark Thompson of the County Circuit Court. Have you ever dealt with someone so drunk on a tiny thimbleful of power that they forget the actual law exists? It's a baffling, infuriating experience. But I promise you, the story of how I used Karen's own overconfidence against her, turning our little community's monthly meeting into a courtroom drama, is going to be incredibly satisfying. She wanted to play by the rules, and I was about to teach her what the real rules were. My first instinct, the one fueled by jet lag and pure indignation, was to find the biggest pair of bolt cutters I could buy and liberate my own front door. But my professional training kicked in. A rash, emotional response is how you lose leverage. A calm, methodical, and overwhelmingly documented response is how you win. I took a dozen high-resolution photos of the lock, the sticker, and my slightly too long grass from every conceivable angle, ensuring the date and time were digitally stamped. Then, instead of calling a locksmith, I called my cousin. Mark answered on the third ring. "Alex, back from Spain? How was it?" I skipped the pleasantries. "Fantastic, but I can't get into my house." I explained the padlock, the sticker, and the 4.5-inch blades of grass that had apparently committed a felony. There was a pause on the line, then a low chuckle. "No, she did not," he said, the humor quickly fading into professional incredulity. "Alex, listen to me very carefully. Do not, under any circumstances, cut that lock. She wants you to. It would muddy the waters, make you look like the aggressor. We're going to let her build her own gallows, plank by plank." He was already shifting from cousin to judge. "I'm going to give you some friendly advice, not as a judge, but as family. First, document your expenses. Hotel, meals, everything. This is no longer an HOA squabble. This is a tortious interference with your property. Second, pull up the HOA covenants, but more importantly, I want you to find the state statutes on landlord-tenant law, specifically anything related to unlawful detainer or illegal eviction." He was right. My anger began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I checked into a nearby hotel, opened my laptop, and went to work. The HOA bylaws were predictable, full of petty rules about trash convisibility and the approved shades of beige for exterior paint. But then I found the clause they all have, the one they hope you never read. All enforcement actions taken by the association must be in accordance with prevailing state and local laws. That was her first mistake. My next stop was the state legislative website. It didn't take long. There it was in stark, unambiguous legal language. A statute that explicitly forbade any party, other than a sheriff with a court-issued writ of possession, from physically barring a resident from their dwelling. The penalties included actual and punitive damages. Karen, in her quest to punish my lawn, hadn't just been a rule. She had shattered a state law. And that bright orange sticker, it wasn't just a notice. It was her signed confession. This was the aha moment. It was the discovery of a fatal structural flaw in your opponent's fortress. Karen thought her power came from her binder of rules. She was about to find out that her binder meant nothing when pitted against the full weight of the state's legal code. Armed with this knowledge, my strategy began to form, guided by Mark's off-the-record legal chess coaching. The plan wouldn't be a frontal assault, but a carefully laid trap. It was clear that dealing with Karen directly or through the feckless HOA management company was pointless. They operated in a bubble of self-importance, and popping that bubble required a public pin. The primary ally in this was, of course, Judge Mark. He couldn't represent me, but he could provide the blueprint. The key, he'd explained over a call from my hotel room, is to make her reject a perfectly reasonable, legally sound off-ramp. Her arrogance is the fulcrum. We need to use it to hoist her. I found another, albeit more reluctant, ally in my next-door neighbor, a retired accountant named George. I saw him nervously trimming his hedges the next morning and went over to talk. He admitted Karen had fined him $100 the previous month because his garden gnome was, in her words, aesthetically discordant. He was terrified of her, but hated what she was doing. He agreed, after some gentle persuasion, to write a statement about his own experiences with her bullying tactics, which I could use as supporting evidence of a pattern of harassment if needed. The core of the plan was a formal, certified letter. It wasn't an angry email. It was a piece of legal art. I spent hours drafting it, with Mark reviewing the language. It was polite, almost deferential in tone, but its contents were pure steel. It began, "Dear Ms. Miller, this letter serves as formal notice regarding the padlock and notice of violation placed on my property at 124 Willow Creek Drive on or about..." It went on to state that while I was happy to discuss any alleged covenant violations, the immediate issue was my illegal lockout. It then cited, chapter and verse, the specific state statute she had violated. The letter concluded with a clear, non-negotiable demand. I require the immediate and unconditional removal of the illegal locking device from my property within 24 hours of your receipt of this letter. Should you fail to comply, I will be forced to pursue all available legal remedies to recover access to my home, including filing for injunctive relief and suing for all resultant damages, court costs, and attorney's fees against you personally and against the Oakmont Estates HOA. The trap was set. A reasonable person or an organization with competent legal counsel would see this letter and immediately backpedal. They'd cut the lock and try to de-escalate. But I was betting on Karen. I was betting on the intoxicating power of the clipboard. I was betting that she would see this meticulously crafted legal warning not as a lifeline, but as a challenge to her authority. The final piece of the strategy was the venue, the monthly HOA meeting scheduled in 2 days. It was the perfect stage. It was a public forum attended by the very people Karen sought to rule over and overseen by the board that enabled her. This wouldn't be about getting my key back. That was a foregone conclusion. This was about restoring the rule of law to our little corner of the world. The certified letter was sent via courier with signature confirmation. I received the email notification at 3:15 p.m. the next day, signed for by K. Miller. The 24-hour clock had started. My phone remained silent. The HOA board didn't call. Karen didn't call. It was exactly as Mark had predicted. Her silence was her admission of guilt, and her inaction was her consent to the consequences. She was walking deeper into the trap with every passing hour. I spent that day meticulously preparing. I compiled a folder, the time-stamped photographs, a copy of the HOA covenants with the state and local laws clause highlighted, a printout of the state statute on illegal lockouts, a copy of the certified letter I sent, and the signed delivery confirmation. I also included a neatly itemized bill for my hotel room, meals, and the estimated cost of a locksmith if I were forced to hire one, all categorized under damages resulting from unlawful detainer. I then spent the evening on the phone with Mark, rehearsing not a speech, but a presentation. He coached me on my tone. Don't be angry, Alex. Be disappointed. Be factual. You're not a victim complaining. You're a citizen informing the board of a serious legal liability they have incurred. You're there to help them understand the gravity of the hole their agent has dug for them. The antagonist's overconfidence was on full display. I learned from George that Karen had been parading around the neighborhood, telling a few of her allies that I was trying to sue her with a silly letter and that I'd learn my place soon enough. She was so blinded by her perceived power that she couldn't see the legal freight train bearing down on her. She believed the HOA's petty rules were a shield that made her invincible, a common delusion among tyrants of all scales. Her brazenness was the final ingredient I needed. It removed any lingering doubt I had about the necessity of a public confrontation. This wasn't just about my padlock anymore. It was about protecting the entire community from her unchecked abuse of authority. She was making it easy for me. She was so convinced of her righteousness that she was going to march into that community center meeting completely oblivious, ready to be lauded for her diligence, while I sat in the audience holding the legal equivalent of a royal flush. The execution phase began the moment the 24-hour deadline expired at 3:16 p.m. Nothing. No call. No email. The lock remained. The violation sticker, now slightly curled at the edges from the afternoon sun, still adorned my door. I made one final recorded call to the HOA management company's main line. I was polite. "Hello, I'm just following up on an urgent issue at 124 Willow Creek Drive. I was illegally locked out of my home by your compliance officer, Karen Miller. I sent a formal legal notice yesterday, and the deadline for compliance has now passed. Can you please inform me of the board's intentions?" The receptionist was utterly lost, stammering about needing to talk to a supervisor who was, conveniently, in a meeting. It was the perfect final piece of documented inaction. That evening, I drove to the community center. The room was exactly as I'd pictured. Fluorescent lights humming over rows of metal folding chairs, a sad-looking coffee urn in the corner, and a long table at the front where the 5-member HOA board sat. Karen was there, of course, not at the main table, but in a chair just to the side, a position of designated authority. She had her binder open and a pen in hand, looking severe and important. She scanned the room, her eyes briefly passing over me without a flicker of recognition or concern. I was just another anonymous homeowner to her. The tension was a low thrum inside me, not of fear, but of anticipation. It was the feeling an engineer gets right before stress testing a bridge, confident in the calculations but waiting for the practical proof. The meeting droned on with the usual business. Minutes from the last meeting, the treasurer's report on landscaping costs, a debate about whether seasonal wreaths were a fire hazard. I sat patiently, my folder resting in my lap. A few neighbors I knew nodded at me, their faces a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. They knew about the padlock. The rumor mill in a suburb runs faster than fiber optic cable. They were all watching to see what would happen. Then came the moment. The board president, a self-important man named Bob, announced, "All right, that brings us to the open forum. Each resident will have 3 minutes. Please state your name and address for the record." This was it. The stage was set. The audience was present. The antagonist was smug and unprepared. I stood up, feeling a dozen pairs of eyes on me, and walked calmly to the small podium set up in the aisle. I placed my folder on it, looked directly at the board, and began. I adjusted the microphone slightly, letting the small squeak of feedback draw every last bit of attention in the room. I didn't look at Karen. I looked at Bob, the board president. "Good evening. My name is Alex Thompson. I live at 124 Willow Creek Drive." My voice was calm, measured, devoid of the rage that had been simmering for days. I let a moment of silence hang in the air before continuing. I have been a homeowner in this community for 10 years. I've always paid my dues on time and done my best to be a good neighbor. I mention this because I need to understand what part of that record justified the actions taken by this board and its agent this past Tuesday. Bob shifted in his seat, looking uneasy. "Mr. Thompson, if this is about a compliance fine, there's a process for that." I held up a hand, a gesture that was both polite and non-negotiable. "With all due respect, Mr. President, this is not about a fine. This is about being criminally barred from my own home." A murmur went through the audience. I opened my folder and slid the first photo out, holding it up. It was a clear, close-up shot of the industrial padlock on my French doors. I returned from a business trip to find this on my door, placed there by Ms. Karen Miller. The reason? My grass was, and I quote from the notice, in excess of 4 inches. I paused. I won't waste our time debating the horticultural merits of a half-inch of grass. What I am here to discuss tonight is the law. I then pulled out the printout of the HOA covenant. Section 94 of our own governing document states that all enforcement actions must comply with state and local laws. A simple, sensible rule. However, Ms. Miller, acting as an agent of this HOA, chose to ignore it now. I turned my head slightly and made eye contact with Karen for the first time. Her smugness had been replaced by a tight, defensive glare. I pulled out the next sheet. According to State Statute 8367, it is unlawful for any landlord, or in this case, a governing association, to prevent a resident from gaining reasonable access to their dwelling unit by any means. It's called an unlawful detainer. It's not a simple infraction. It is illegal. I let that sink in. To ensure the board was aware of this severe legal misstep, I sent a formal certified letter to Ms. Miller, outlining the violation of law and giving her a 24-hour window to remedy the situation by simply removing the lock. I have here, I said, holding up the slip, the signed receipt confirming she received this notice yesterday afternoon at 3:15 p.m. Karen shot to her feet. Now hold on. You were in clear violation of the covenants. I have photos. I documented everything. You can't just ignore the rules. Her voice was shrill, laced with panic. Bob, the president, banged his gavel weakly. Ms. Miller, please. Mr. Thompson, your 3 minutes are up. This was the moment. The pivot. My 3 minutes to discuss a community issue may be up, Mr. President, I said, my voice dropping slightly, becoming more serious. But the clock on your legal liability has just begun. You see, the failure to respond to my formal notice has fundamentally changed the nature of this discussion. I looked past Bob, past the flustered board members, and let my gaze sweep across the stunned faces of my neighbors. I had a lengthy conversation about this situation with my cousin. He's a bit of an expert in these matters. He found the flagrant disregard for state law to be, in his words, breathtakingly reckless. He strongly advised me that this public meeting, which I know is being recorded for the official record, was the ideal venue to put the board on formal notice before I proceed with legal action. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle in the silent room. Perhaps some of you know my cousin, the Honorable Judge Mark Thompson. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. You could have heard a covenant drop. Karen's face, which had been red with anger, turned a ghostly, chalky white. Her entire posture deflated, as if her strings had been cut. Bob's jaw was literally hanging open. He looked from me to Karen and back again, his mind frantically trying to process the information. I pressed the advantage. Judge Thompson was kind enough to review the statutes and my documentation. He agreed that I have a clear and actionable case for illegal lockout, trespassing, and I can now seek significant punitive damages due to your willful negligence after being formally notified. The lawsuit, which will be filed tomorrow morning, will name Ms. Karen Miller, personally, for her actions, and every single member of this board, jointly and severally, for gross negligence in your fiduciary duty to the homeowners you represent. The room erupted. An elderly woman in the back shouted. She tried to find me for my bird bath. Another man stood up. She threatened to have my truck towed from my own driveway. The dam of fear Karen had built over the years burst in an instant. Her power, derived entirely from bluff and intimidation, had evaporated under the harsh glare of actual law and consequence. She looked utterly broken, a petty tyrant suddenly stripped of her imaginary crown, exposed for all to see. The aftermath was swift and decisive. In the chaotic moments following my announcement, the board president, Bob, bypassed all procedural decorum, sputtering apologies and promising immediate action. He turned to a visibly trembling Karen and said, in a voice loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Give me the key." Right now, Karen, looking completely defeated, fumbled in her purse and produced a single, small key, which the board treasurer practically snatched from her hand. Within 20 minutes, a small, humiliated procession consisting of the board president, the treasurer, and a hired handyman arrived at my house. I stood by as the handyman, with a simple turn of the key, removed the padlock that had caused so much trouble. The satisfying click of the lock opening was the first note in a symphony of vindication. Bob couldn't stop apologizing, assuring me the HOA would cover all my expenses and that Karen's actions were an unfortunate overstep. The next morning, I received a formal email informing me that Karen Miller had been suspended from all duties, pending a full investigation. A week later, she was officially terminated. The threat of a personal lawsuit against the board members, guided by the implicit oversight of a county judge, had worked wonders. They were terrified. They not only agreed to pay my hotel and food expenses, but also offered to cover my landscaping for the rest of the year as a gesture of goodwill. More importantly, the entire affair forced a revolution within our HOA. A special town hall was called, not by the old board, but by a coalition of homeowners I had inadvertently galvanized. The community, now fully aware of the limits of the HOA's power, demanded and enacted sweeping changes. New bylaws were drafted, requiring a multi-stage warning system for violations, establishing a fair and independent appeals committee, and explicitly stating that no action could be taken that infringed on a homeowner's statutory rights. The era of the clipboard tyrant was over. The board members who had enabled Karen were voted out at the next election, replaced by reasonable people, including my neighbor George, the gnome enthusiast who found a surprising passion for fair governance. Looking back, the entire ordeal was a lesson in the nature of power. Karen wasn't truly powerful. She was just loud and aggressive, and for a long time, no one had called her bluff. She wielded a set of rules she didn't fully understand and operated under the assumption that her authority was absolute. It's a common mistake made by bullies in all walks of life, from the playground to the boardroom to a suburban cul-de-sac. They rely on their victims not knowing their own strength, not knowing the real rules of the game. My strength wasn't anger or a pair of bolt cutters. It was knowledge, patience, and a well-executed strategy. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to come home to my own house. But when that peace was taken from me, I realized that fighting back didn't have to mean stooping to their level. It meant rising above it, using the very systems of law and order they pretend to represent to hold them accountable. The law isn't just a weapon for lawyers and judges. It's a shield for every citizen. You just have to take the time to read it and have the courage to hold it up. The ultimate moral of this story is simple. Know your rights. Read the documents that govern your life, whether it's an employment contract, a lease, or your HOA covenants. Understand that no rule written by a committee can supersede the fundamental laws of your state and country. Petty tyranny thrives in the darkness of ignorance and apathy. When you shine the light of knowledge on it, it tends to wither and crumble. So, let me ask you one final question. Have you read your own bylaws lately? You might be surprised what's in there. And more importantly, what isn't. Don't wait for a padlock to appear on your door to find out who really holds the power.